Welcome to another podcast by Pilot Institute, and today I am talking to Marc Kegelaers, who is the CEO of Unifly. Now, Unifly is a company that provides UAST traffic management, UTM. You may have heard that word in the past. And basically what they do is they connect authorities with the pilots so they can safely integrate drones into the airspace. And they have customers all over the world. And Marc, welcome to our podcast.
Well, I'm happy to be here, Greg. It's a long time since we met. But I'm happy to talk to you and to be part of this podcast.
Thank you. And Marc, there was some news yesterday that I saw about Unifly. Tell us a little bit more about what you did with Canada.
Well, we at Unifly, our UTM system, we typically market that to ANSPs, the FAAs of this world, if you like, so that they can offer UTM services to the market to drive the drone market. And we have just been selected as a strategic partner for NAV Canada. So we will be supplying them with the national UTM system, which will be rolled out over all of Canada, which is a major thing for us. It's the second largest airspace in the world is managed by NAV Canada, and then for us to by NAV Canada is a real big thing.
Well, congratulations. This is huge.
Yes, it is.
So I want to say, first and foremost, I want to say that I have a tremendous respect for Marc. Marc and I have known each other for quite a while. We were in the flight training world together a few years ago, and then Marc decided to go into the UAS world. Marc is a visionary. I know he knows the topic very well, and with the remote ID around the corner in the US, the NPRM, I wanted to get a fresh perspective from somebody else, from somebody who's actually been doing it in the real world, with actual UTM implementation in Europe and actually all over the world. So, Marc, tell us a little bit more about how you get into the UAS world. You're a man pilot, you've been doing this for a long time, and how did you transition?
Well, that's about 7 or 8 years ago. I was managing a flight school, a school for professional pilots. And one day, one of my coworkers came into my office and said, "Marc, I have this wonderful idea." I said, "Yeah, what is it?" I said, "Well, I think there's a new market out there that we should go into." I said, "Okay, what is it?" "Well, we should be training pilots for aircraft without pilots." I said, "Come again? Could you please explain?" And he convinced me that there was going to be a market where a large number of drones would be being flown by drone operators, and that they would need some level of training. So with the knowledge of that we had in training pilots for manned aviation, we had written our own flight training manuals in our training handbooks. We've created our checklists and so on. We used all of that knowledge to build a very, very good and very solid training program for drone pilots, which still is very active today. We now call that program the Drone University. We've been training hundreds of pilots over the last several years. We even had contracts with the military here in Belgium to train their drone pilots. So it's been wonderful. So that's the way that I came about in the unmanned world. And at some stage there were a number of young air traffic controllers who saw that there was a need for unmanned traffic management, or then it was still called a very low level airspace management system. And that's how I got involved. So it's my heritage of being in the manned aviation led me to use that information, use that knowledge to create something for the unmanned world.
And it's funny you say that because I remember visiting your facility in Belgium and seeing in that hangar you had these mats and these nets all over and you were flying those drones. And that was way before anybody in the US I had heard was gearing towards drones. So you were definitely at the forefront of doing this, which is awesome. I want to talk about UTM because UTM is something that's going to lead into remote ID. If any of the listeners have read the NPRM or the guide that we put together to help comment on the NPRM, you know that part of the reason for remote ID is implementation of unmanned traffic management. And Unifly has been doing this for a while, and they do this not only with state regulation or country regulation, I should say, and local regulation as well. And they try to integrate all of this so they can share the information with the pilots and local regulators and traffic management. So, Marc, can you tell us a little bit more about the real life implementation that you've been going through with Unifly and kind of the different stakeholders that are involved in doing this UTM?
So one of the real world implementations that we've done is in Germany, for instance, where we sold our system to the Deutsche Flugsicherung, which is the German equivalent of the FAA. And what they're using our system to show pilots or drone pilots where they can fly. Now, that's not just related to aviation airspace, but there's let's say where you can fly or not fly really depends on the legislation. And the legislation in Germany is really complex. There's about 23 different sets of parameters that we need to evaluate to determine if a person can fly a drone somewhere, yay or nay. And it comes from you cannot fly a drone over, let's say, a river where you have commercial boat traffic. You cannot fly a drone over a natural park. You cannot fly a drone over prisons. So all of those, let's say, data sets you need to have, you need to ingest in your system, in addition to the aviation data, and you have to present that in ways that people can very easily use. On top of that, we also support the concept of dynamic airspace management, where we can give authorities, local authorities, very user-friendly tools so that they can close up or close or open pieces of airspace on a temporary basis. We've also implemented a very comprehensive flight approval mechanism where when you do a flight, if you want to do a flight, you have to get approval from maybe the local air traffic controllers for controlled airspace, but also maybe of the local authority, the local city, or other organizations that own the surface where you're flying over. So very complex flight approval process, lots and lots of data, providing a very user interface, very user-friendly user interface to end users that just want to do things and fly their drones.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the challenges of keeping all of this together in a minute. So what I find interesting is that Europe is in the process of has already tried to put together some common rules for everyone flying in Europe, but there's also still a lot of local regulation that you guys can work with. Is that right?
Yes, and that I think that's not uncommon for the aviation world, because if you look at the rules of ICAO, they are the same for everywhere. But every country has a slightly different, let's say, approach. Now, again, the rules that have been put together in Europe and have been implemented, it wants to create a level playing field so that if a drone operator has a license to fly in, let's say, Holland, he can easily use that same license to go and fly in Greece. But there will always be some local things that you cannot regulate at the national level. So yes, there's always a little bit of leeway in those regulations, some exceptions, local exceptions that can be implemented, yes.
So this is where I think it's a little bit different from the US, and this is also where your solution comes in, because you're like the bank of information that gathers all of this data and shares it with the pilots, so the pilots don't have to be digging into each regulation locally. What I see in the US is a slightly different thing. We have the federal level with the FAA that kind of governs all the airspace, and then local authorities don't really have controls of that airspace, but they do have control of the ground in most cases, where the airplane can take off and land, the aircraft, I should say, not airplane. And do you think for you, from your solution, from your perspective, is it easier to deal with something like in the US or something like in Europe where you have more local regulation?
For us, from a technology point of view, it's actually the same thing. One of the challenges that local authorities have, who only have authority of ground risks, if you may, is there will be moments that the ground risk is so high that they really don't want drones to be flying there, or for privacy reasons, or there's a VIP coming to town. They really don't want the drones to be flying there. Now today, to get the TFR active, it's a lengthy process, and the more cities that want that, the more cumbersome that becomes. Now it's very thinkable of providing a local authority with a very user-friendly interface, so that he can, let's say, prohibit takeoff and land at certain moments in time for his city. So for us as a technology, let's say, company, we have created an environment where we can easily work with aviation parameters or ground risk-based parameters.
But this is also not a free-for-all. So I can think of my listeners right now thinking, well, if a government decides that they don't want you flying over this area, then they can just shut it down, which is something that UAS operators don't want. But I think your solution still has a lot of oversight from the aviation authority. Is that right?
Oh yes, of course. Yeah. The one of the things that, for instance, in the European regulation now is as defined is the possibility to create what they call geo zones. Local authorities will have the capability of creating a no-drone zone on the fly, but let's say there's an authorization process that sits behind it. So that no-drone zone, the definition of that no-drone zone is sent to a central, let's say, organization, or typically the FAA would be in the States, and they then endorse yay or nay. Can we allow this to happen, yes or no? And in some cases, that authorization will be done automatic. In some cases, that will not be done automatic. Let's call it almost like a land system, but instead of asking for approval to do a flight, it's asking for approval to close off a piece of airspace.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes total sense. So like, lands requests for local authorities to block some airspace for a specific reason. Okay. I want to talk about UTM. In my head, coming from the manned aviation world, I can think of air traffic controllers. They're sitting in the tower and they're looking at traffic and looking at a radar screen. A UTM manager, what does that look like? Is that someone who's in the same room as an ATM, who's also looking at a radar? Tell me more about the physical aspect of what this looks like from a UTM standpoint.
There are various aspects to it, but in the long run, the entire, let's say, traffic management for drones will be done fully automatically. There will be a federated system where flight authorizations will be given automatically, deviations will be done automatically. So that's the long term. Currently in practice today, is what we see is that yes, a terminal of ours typically is put in the control in the control room of the air traffic control tower, and we provide information on where flights are planned, where flights are going on, and if the unit is equipped with remote ID and a tracking device, then we'll be able to say who it is, who is flying, and what type of drone, and so on and so forth. So yes, physically right now, one of the elements is that yes, the air traffic controller will have a screen on his desk that combines the drone traffic and the manned traffic, so that he's able to see and identify potential conflicts. Very
good. The next thing I kind of want to talk about, and linking it to the NPRM from the FAA, is the technology that you're using to do all of this. The big point of contention right now in the US is trying to use network data and trying to use broadcast data. From a technology perspective, how is your data shared from the UAS to the UTM, to your software? I know it's not ADS-B because we kind of talked about this, and I know the FAA is not for ADS-B for drones either, for good reasons. But so how do you do it? What's the technology behind all this?
Well, there are two aspects, two different aspects. On one hand, it's how does the drone share its ID to the outside world in general. And there you should look at, let's say, the equivalent of a license plate. Yeah, how does a car say I'm car 1234? It just has a plate on it. What we've done is we created what we call a blip, a broadcast location and identity platform. It's a small device that has a GPS detector on board. It knows where it is based on GPS signals. And then the first thing it does, what it does constantly is to broadcast to the outside world using Bluetooth technology who he is. It transmits a number, and it transmits where the pilot sits and where the drone is at that moment. So relatively basic information that can be captured by any, say, any phone that is equipped with the necessary software. So that's very simple. Anyone could detect that information. Now, for the general public, that means that they will be able to identify, yeah, this drone has a license plate, yeah or nay, just like you are today able to determine that, yes, this car has a license plate, yeah or nay. You know the number of license plate, but you don't really know who it is. So that there's still a protection of privacy there. Now, there's another element that we've developed is that it's an app which we will only give to police officers and other authorities. And there, the Bluetooth information that comes into the app will then interrogate a UTM system. Is this a person that is known? Is this a pilot that is known? Is he on an approved flight plan? Yes or no? So that's the identification part of it. There's a second element, which is a tracking. For me, those are two different things. The tracking information we send via the mobile network to a central UTM system. So the central UTM system will then have the ID of the pilot, of the drone user, the drone operator, the exact location, and in the UTM system, we do the full tracking and merging that with information from all sorts of sources. So we make a clear distinction between e-identification on the one hand and tracking on the other hand. The e-identification is really something like, it's a license plate, and the license plate can be read by anyone who has basic information. It can also be read by security and police forces who then can interrogate a UTM database for more information. And then the separate thing is providing tracking information to a central UTM system so that the air traffic controllers typically, or even police forces, can know where the drones are.
So your blip system requires both ID, identification, and tracking, or is identification enough?
Well, it depends on the usage. So we have two different devices. One that does only identification, and there's one that does both identification and tracking. Now, the one that does identification only would typically be used for, say, small drones that fly VLOS. You know, if you're flying VLOS, you know that the pilot is going to be in a not very close to the drone. So if you know where the drone is, it's all you need is an identification of user and maybe also where the drone is. The tracking is really what you need if you fly BVLOS, and or if you fly drones in a, say, protected area like a CTR or close to a city or close to an industrial site. Then you really want to know where the drones are, and then you really want to do some tracking. But in a large majority of cases, it's absolutely wanting to know where the drone is not necessary in our opinion. But you really want to know, let's say, who the pilot is.
It makes total sense to me, and I think that's what a lot of people are trying to comment on the current NPRM, myself included, is the fact that you don't need to know where the drone is at all time. There are a lot of situations, especially in the US, where you have so much open land and areas that are completely uncontrolled, away from people, away from everything, then you don't really need all that. The identification, I agree with you, would be nice to have so you know who's flying around. Now, the blip that only provides identification. So I'm thinking of the person that has an FPV drone that's flying, low altitude, kind of locally. Is there a distance limit other than line of sight for this kind of device?
Well, the distance limit depends on the distance that we can achieve with BLE. So we use the Bluetooth low energy. We can go up to, right now it's in meters. It's about 600 meters, which is large enough to be able to do a visual line of sight. So if you go beyond that, you would probably need a tracking device. But purely for identification, it's for most users, it's more than enough.
So most users out there that are flying FPV keep the drone within line of sight, or they're flying a foam aircraft, they can just slap that device on and then never have to think about it. It just sends the information and then it's compliant.
That's it. They slap it on. At the start of the flight, they use an app to let's say to have the unit start transmitting. But other than that, there's no button on it. There's nothing. It really is very easy to use. It's a simple device, but it works and it sends the information via Bluetooth, and it let's say it responds to the needs of typically of the local police. Typically, the local police guy gets a complaint that there's a drone flying over the school. He wants to know, is it a drone that is friendly? Does it have a license plate? And if it has a license plate, who is that person? But that can be done very pragmatically and fairly easy using our blip, yeah.
And I think that's also what DJI has been trying to show with a bunch of videos recently. They have the similar technology with their solution of remote ID integrated into the drone. But I think what a lot of people fear is that they won't be able to comply with this if they have a less complex drone, like an FPV drone or something like this. So it sounds like your solution is pretty simple and just slap it on and then good to go. Reading the NPRM, and I'm sure you have read some portions of it or have been reading about the remote ID in the US, the solution that the FAA is proposing is fairly complex and requires both ID and tracking. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when first reading the NPRM, I got the impression that they were trying to create a Swiss Army knife solution to solve all of the problems in the drone world. But it's not very pragmatic. We'd like to give solutions that will work for everyone in the market. Like the private person who has a small drone who's flying over his own land. Do you really need identification? Maybe not. Then the small drone that is not flying over his own home, but in the vicinity of, in the middle of nowhere, in the vicinity of a small town. Yes, there you will need identification. Do you want tracking there? Probably not. So we really build up a solution that will work for everyone without people being afraid of that their privacy is encumbered, that whatever technology solution is created will prevent them from flying a drone. No, we build practical solutions so that people can actually start to work, and we can still comply with the requirements of the Homeland Security people.
Yeah, makes sense again. I think it's pretty straightforward. I wish the FAA would think it a little simpler sometimes, but from a pilot perspective, what does your solution look like? What does does the person go into an app on the phone and then just request a block of airspace, kind of like what we do with Lance at the moment?
Yeah, very similar. In fact, our application, we are Lance compliant. So we have, we are one of the 21 Lance approved companies. So yes, our solution is, you go into our solution, you can see the airspace where you want to fly, you draw yourself where you want to fly, and the system will say yay or nay, you may or may not. And then if you're close to an airport and you need to do a Lance request, we can process that Lance request. So yes, it's not unlike many of the other applications that are out there. But just the way that we've been marketing it, we have been marketing it through the national authority. So you would normally see soon you will have in NAV Canada. In Canada, you will have an application provided by NAV Canada to do all of the planning and all the flight requests automatically. In Germany, there's a German application where you can do, let's say, the planning. Exactly, the application that we provide is a combination of before you fly and a registration system and the alliance system. So it's a combination of a number of things.
And I like that. From a pilot perspective, I hate having to go into different applications to do three things that could be done in one. So I'm glad to hear what you're saying. What's the cost of Unifly to the pilot? Is it free? And if it is, what's the cost? And I'm sure it depends on the country probably that you're selling your solution to, right?
Well, the way that we sell it, we charge to the ANSP, and then we've seen countries where the app is given free of charge to the pilot, and in other countries the pilot needs to pay for it. But in that pricing mechanism, we don't play. We have been selling the product to professional users, and they typically would need to think about $15 per month per drone.
There's a fear in the US that some USS are going to be providing the service for free, but as we know, free is never free, and the data is going to be shared and sold to third parties. What's your take on that?
The way that we sell it, we sell our system as a platform to the ANSP, and we do not own the data. So we do charge for our product, and then it's up to the ANSP to collect the data and then collect the money from. But I'm not a big fan of, let's say, between brackets, stealing the data of end users and then monetizing that. I build software, and I want to be paid for building that software.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with that. I mean, from a user perspective, I would prefer to pay for something and know that my data is being kept safe rather than having something for free and then everything being sold to somebody else. So I can understand that.
That's entirely our philosophy. We build a good, complex software environment, and yes, we have software licenses that we charge, but we do not have the objective of owning the data of the users. That's not what we want to do.
Good to hear. One of the fear also with the proposed regulation right now from a lot of people, myself included, is that this could be a major failure if the compliance rate is close to zero. And as proposed right now, the FPV community and home builders will basically be forced to not comply. And how does that look like? What's the compliance rate? And that's probably hard to measure with your solution. And then what are the penalties if that doesn't happen, if you don't comply?
Well, again, the way that we sell our product, it's in those countries, like an example here in Belgium is the ANSP in Belgium are using our system to connect themselves to the drone population. And it's very simple. Every commercial user, a drone user, and every drone user must be registered in the system and needs to use the tool of the ANSP to do flight requests. And if you don't use the tool of the ANSP, you don't get permissions to fly. So there's a big incentive to actually use it.
Yep, that's good. From a law enforcement perspective, I was reading on your website that you allow law enforcement to actually not only have access to the data, but if they wanted to have a TFR go up and block people. So if there's an accident, for example, and they wanted to clear the airspace for a helicopter to come in and rescue, then they could do that. How does that look like from a user perspective? If, let's say, a TFR just popped up in the area in which you're flying and you have the blip on your device that is only broadcast, how would the system deal with this?
If you're a user, you would probably have our application open when you're flying. Then let's say the TFR or the equivalent of that would pop up in real time on your screen. Normally, you would also have, let's say, issued a flight plan or given a notification that you would be flying. Once that is in the database, and at that moment while you are flying, there's a TFR being created, then the system knows that and will actually send you an email or a text message saying, yeah, the flight that you're doing now, guess what, there's a TFR. So there's an automatic system there that the pilots are notified, without human intervention. So all the pilots that are flying in that area at that moment, even without a blip, but if they've given a notification that I will be in that region, then they will get a notification.
Very interesting. Very interesting. From a data management, since we're talking about all this data and sending notification, it's got to be interesting, to say the least, for you guys to keep track of all the regulation, including local regulation. So how does Unifly deal with this? How do you get notified when there is a new regulation, or is the notification going through you anyway in the first place to get approved? Is that how you get your data?
Different levels of data. Let's say the more static data. That's typically the responsibility of the ANSP or the local authority or the state DOT that to collect that static data. And the static data is the airspace data, is the let's say the GIS data, the no drones, and the static data. When it comes to the dynamic data, there we provide the tool for the local authority to just fill it in, create the no drones, because that's typically it. And even without our intervention, that becomes let's say a real-time thing. Now, if there are things that are more of a static nature and the legislation really starts to change, then we have to be notified. But then we sign a contract with whoever local authority that they need to provide us with the information.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's talk about the future a little bit, and that's probably near future. Package deliveries, autonomous air taxi, that's coming around the corner, and that's going to clutter the airspace and have a lot more flights going on out there. How do you not only integrate manned aviation with autonomous flights, but also unmanned aviation that is non-autonomous, like people like me or the average person flying their drone? How do they get away from an autonomous delivery drone or autonomous air taxi drone? And how does your solution come into play?
Well, the rules on how, who gets priority over who, those rules are not fixed yet. What we can do today is combine all of that traffic on a screen, and then it's up to the local air traffic controller to decide who gets priority and who does what. There are now a lot of talks internationally on what do the rules need to be. Does a autonomous drone have priority over manned aviation? Question mark. It's not clear yet. Does an unmanned taxi, will they have priority over, let's say, a drone providing medicine to a remote hospital? Those things are not clear yet. So let's say, at some stage there will be algorithms that define the priority rules, but they're not there. So we'd like to think that whatever rules are made, that we will be able to implement them, but the rules don't exist yet.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot of work to be done there, and I'm sure that's one of the limitations for you as well. We'll talk about that in a second. You're past the implementation, you're past the development phase now, and you're going into implementation. What's your next big milestone for Unifly?
There's plenty of milestones. Our big milestones is that with the product that we currently have, we can serve most of the ANSPs in the world and most of the users in the world. So the big milestones are like what's happened now is winning enough Canada's, and we have a number of proposals out that we would like to win. The next big milestone is to use this technology that we've now built for drones, start using that for the general aviation as well, because what we've created now is an extremely user-friendly user interface for drone users to be able to plan flights and manage flight and issue the equivalent of a flight plan. Now it's so user-friendly that we have had some countries where the ANSP said, "Wow, this is good," could we start using that technology to serve the general aviation world? And the answer is, yeah, we probably could. So we could actually give the general aviation pilots, the PPLs and the CPLs, a really, really interesting user interface that makes it very easy to understand the airspace that they want to fly in, makes it very easy to plan it, and makes it very easy to issue a flight plan. So that's the next big thing.
And then you can integrate really everyone else. Everyone that's flying in the airspace can be integrated under one solution. Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. What's the biggest obstacle you see right now to full implementations in really any country? I'm sure the obstacles are a little bit different for each, but what's slowing you down the most?
What's slowing us down is a regulation. The regulation has to be in place for it to be used. Secondly, UTM is still quite a new thing. It's like 4 years ago, the world, maybe 5 years ago, the world UTM was not even invented yet. So we are having to do a lot of educational stuff to large organizations to explain what UTM is, what the advantages are, and how to use it. And then because it's so new, it creates a new workflow within the ANSPs, which is, let's say, a challenge all on its own. There's a lot of people involved within an ANSP that one wants to start to implement UTM. It's not only the air traffic controllers, it's also the administration around it, its responsibility definitions, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to implement the UTM. And that's, is that slowing us now? That's just a long implementation cycle.
Well, the good news is you can probably help a lot of these regulators as well with guidance, I'm guessing, with your expertise, right?
That is correct. That's what we've been doing. We are some of our collaborators and some of our workers can be found on these national and international committees and that are drafting the international regulations and international standards, and they appreciate it because of the experience that we've now built. We have a number of countries where our UTM system is in service and in providing good quality service to the industry, and that makes it less abstract, because very often regulators live in a very abstract world, and we bring the real world experience to that table.
So when are we going to see Unifly in the FAA market, in the United States market?
Well, we already have an office in New York and an operational office in Syracuse, so we are already in the States. Our priority within the US is now we're trying to convince the local, let's say the DOTs in every state to work with us. I don't think that the FAA will ever buy a national UTM system. They are very much into the federated system. But I do feel and I do sense that the DOTs of every state do want to have a bit more tighter control on or view of what's happening in their state as far as drone traffic is concerned, and we can certainly help them there.
Well, this is all the questions I have, Marc. Thank you for your time. Was there anything else that you wanted to bring up, talk about?
No, it's just that we're living in a wonderful time. I sense that the drone market is still a very young market, and I think that there's lots of things that can happen. We as a company, we know that we have built a technology that will enable the drone market. It's there's a lot of national authorities and the states are hesitant to allow drones to fly, but they will allow drones to fly once they are certain that they have a means of identifying and tracking the drones and to manage pieces of airspace, and that's exactly what we do. We have seen that in the countries where we are being used, that the drone market is really picking up and really growing. So that's what we bring to the table. We have a technology that once you start to implement that, it will help the drone industry grow.
Yeah, it definitely is a very young market, and there's still a lot of work to be done, and a lot of changes that are going to happen in the next, even the next 4 or 5 years. I think we'll see a completely different landscape. Well, Marc, thank you for your time. And if any of our listeners have questions, leave them down there, and then I'll see if Marc is willing to answer some of them and see where we go from here. So, Marc, thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be part of this. Thank you.